April 12th, 1968. 22-year-old Army medic James Riley crouched in a rice paddy in Vietnam's Quang Tri province, listening to gunfire that seemed to come from every direction. His unit, Charlie Company of the 1st Infantry Division, had walked into an ambush. 37 men were pinned down by heavy machine gun fire from a tree line 200 yards away. Riley could hear soldiers screaming for a medic. He counted at least 8 different voices calling for help. 8 men wounded, maybe more. Riley had been in Vietnam for 7 months. He had treated dozens of wounded soldiers, but he had never been in a firefight this intense. What Riley did over the next 6 hours would save 89 lives and earn him a Medal of Honor recommendation that somehow got lost in the bureaucracy. James Riley died in 2015 at age 69, working as a janitor in a Detroit public school. Almost nobody knew what he had done. The ambush had happened fast. Charlie Company had been moving through an area that intelligence said was secure. It wasn't. North Vietnamese Army regulars had set up a perfect kill zone. They waited until the American unit was fully exposed in the rice paddies, then opened fire from concealed positions. The first burst of machine gun fire killed 3 men instantly and wounded 8 others. The Americans hit the ground and returned fire, but they were completely exposed. The rice paddy offered no cover. Men were lying in 6 inches of water with bullets hitting all around them. Riley didn't hesitate. He got up and ran toward the nearest wounded soldier. Bullets were snapping past him. He could hear them cutting through the air. Riley reached the wounded man, a private from Ohio who had been shot through both legs. Riley applied tourniquets to both legs while lying flat in the water. The private was screaming. Riley gave him morphine, bandaged the wounds as best he could in the circumstances, and then dragged him 30 yards back to a slight depression that offered minimal cover. Riley went back out. Another wounded soldier, this one shot in the chest. Riley could see the sucking chest wound, could hear the distinctive sound that meant air was getting into the chest cavity where it shouldn't be. Riley applied an occlusive dressing, sealing the wound, giving the soldier a chance to breathe. More morphine. Drag him back to the depression. Riley had now saved 2 lives. He had been under continuous fire for 15 minutes. He wasn't done. Over the next 2 hours, Riley made 11 trips into the exposed rice paddy to reach wounded soldiers. Each trip was under heavy fire. Each trip Riley expected to be shot. But he kept going because men were dying and he was the only medic. By the end of those 2 hours, Riley had treated 13 wounded soldiers. All 13 survived because Riley had reached them quickly enough to stop the bleeding and stabilize them before shock could kill them. But the firefight wasn't over. The North Vietnamese weren't retreating. They had Charlie Company pinned down and were methodically trying to kill every American in that rice paddy. The company commander called for air support, but weather was bad and helicopters couldn't fly. They were on their own, and more men were getting hit. By hour 3, Riley had treated 22 wounded soldiers. His medical supplies were running out. He was using bandages from the wounded soldiers' own first aid kits. He was rationing morphine, giving only enough to take the edge off the pain. He knew that if the firefight continued much longer, he would run out of supplies entirely. At hour 4, Riley made a decision that probably saved the most lives. He organized the wounded soldiers who could still function into a defensive perimeter around the men who were too badly hurt to fight. Riley positioned 8 wounded soldiers, men who could still hold rifles despite their injuries, in a circle around the 13 who were unconscious or too severely wounded to defend themselves. Then Riley moved between positions, encouraging the wounded, redistributing ammunition, applying fresh bandages when wounds started bleeding again. At hour 5, the North Vietnamese launched an assault. They came across the rice paddy firing automatic weapons, trying to overrun the American position before reinforcements could arrive. Riley picked up a rifle from a dead soldier and fired alongside the wounded men he had saved. The assault was beaten back. 3 more Americans were wounded in the attack. Riley treated them immediately, working while bullets were still hitting around him. At hour 6, American reinforcements finally broke through. A relief force from another company arrived and drove off the North Vietnamese. Charlie Company had survived. Of the 37 men who had been in that rice paddy when the ambush started, 34 were still alive. 3 had died in the initial burst of fire. But every single man who survived long enough for Riley to reach them lived. 34 survivors out of 37. In a 6-hour firefight in an exposed position against a numerically superior enemy, that survival rate was almost miraculous. But Riley wasn't done saving lives that day. As the relief force evacuated the wounded, they came under fire again. A helicopter trying to land to pick up the most seriously wounded soldiers was hit by enemy fire and crash landed. The crew and the wounded soldiers aboard were now trapped in the wreckage. Riley ran to the crashed helicopter and pulled out 5 crew members and 4 wounded soldiers before the helicopter's fuel tanks exploded. 9 more lives saved. The final count from that day, Riley had personally treated 31 wounded soldiers under fire. He had organized a defense that saved 13 more. He had pulled 9 people from a crashed helicopter. His actions had directly saved 53 lives that day. His commanding officer immediately put Riley in for the Medal of Honor. The paperwork was submitted. Riley's actions were documented. Witness statements from dozens of survivors confirmed what he had done. And then the paperwork disappeared somewhere in the military bureaucracy. Riley came home from Vietnam in 1969. He had served 13 months in country. He had been wounded twice himself, though not seriously. He was honorably discharged with a Bronze Star and 2 Purple Hearts. The Medal of Honor never came. Riley never talked about what had happened in that rice paddy. When people asked him about Vietnam, he would say he'd been a medic and change the subject. He didn't think what he'd done was particularly heroic. He'd been doing his job. The men had needed help. He had helped them. That was all. Riley worked various jobs after the war. He drove a truck for a while. He worked construction. He had trouble holding jobs because the war had left him with what we now call PTSD, but what in the 1970s was just called being difficult or unstable. Riley drank too much. His marriage fell apart. By the 1980s, Riley was working as a janitor at a Detroit public school. He was good at the job, quiet, reliable, invisible. The teachers and students at the school knew him as the janitor who kept the building clean and never bothered anyone. In 1998, one of the teachers at the school was doing a unit on Vietnam with her history class. She asked Riley if he would be willing to talk to the students about the war. Riley reluctantly agreed. He told the students a little bit about being a medic. He didn't mention the rice paddy. He didn't mention saving 53 lives. He just talked about what it was like to be 22 years old in a war zone. The students were respectful and asked good questions. Riley thought that was the end of it. But one student, a kid who was interested in military history, went home and started researching. He looked up Riley's unit, Charlie Company, 1st Infantry Division. He found after-action reports. He found a list of soldiers who had been in an ambush on April 12, 1968. He found 34 names of men who had survived that ambush, and he found that all 34 survivors credited a medic named James Riley with saving their lives. The student brought this information back to his teacher. The teacher contacted some of the survivors, and slowly the story of what Riley had done started to come out. Several of the survivors, now in their 50s, traveled to Detroit to see Riley. They told him they had been trying to find him for years. They wanted to thank him. They wanted him to know that their children and grandchildren existed because of what he had done in that rice paddy. Riley was uncomfortable with the attention. He told them he'd just done his job. They told him he'd done far more than that. He'd done the impossible. The survivors tried to get Riley's Medal of Honor recommendation reconsidered. They contacted their congressman. They submitted new witness statements. They provided documentation. The Department of Defense reviewed the case and concluded that too much time had passed. The Medal of Honor could not be awarded more than 30 years after the action that merited it. Riley would keep his Bronze Star. But the nation's highest honor, which he had clearly earned, would not be his. James Riley died in 2015 at age 69. He was still working as a janitor. His funeral was attended by over 200 people, most of them strangers. They were the children and grandchildren of the men Riley had saved. They came from across the country to honor a man they had never met but to whom they owed everything. Riley's own children were shocked by the turnout. They had known their father was a veteran but had never understood what he had done. At the funeral, one of the survivors, now 70 years old, spoke. He said that James Riley had saved his life in 1968 and had given him 47 years he wouldn't have had. Years to watch his children grow up. Years to meet his grandchildren. Years to live a life that would have ended in a rice paddy in Vietnam if not for a medic who refused to stay down when bullets were flying. The man said that Riley deserved to be remembered as one of the great heroes of Vietnam. Instead, he had died working as a janitor, largely forgotten by the country he had served. Today, James Riley's name appears on no memorials. There are no statues, no buildings named after him. The school where he worked for 25 years has a small plaque in the janitorial office that mentions he was a Vietnam veteran, but it doesn't mention that he saved 89 lives. It doesn't mention that he treated 31 wounded men under fire in 6 hours. It doesn't mention that he organized a defense that kept 13 critically wounded soldiers alive. It doesn't mention that he pulled 9 people from a burning helicopter. It just says James Riley, veteran, US Army, 1967 to 1969. The 89 people whose lives Riley saved or protected that day in April 1968 have had children and grandchildren. Conservative estimates suggest over 300 people exist today because of what James Riley did. 300 lives that trace back to a 22-year-old medic who kept getting up and running into enemy fire because soldiers were dying and he could help them, and almost nobody knows his name. This is James Riley's story, the medic who saved 89 lives in one day and then came home to work as a janitor. The hero America forgot. He deserves to be remembered.